You know, when we drafted the description for today's program with the title, the question, can there be a grand bargain between China and the United States? This was less than a month ago, and it was an entirely plausible framing less than a month ago. It says a lot about the speed with which developments are happening that that framing is less plausible today. We're going to lean into that. We're going to lean into um, the degree to which that framing maybe made sense a few weeks ago, um, maybe makes less sense today, might make more sense a few weeks from now. We'll have to see. The other thing that was the case for when we put this program together was the interlocutor was initially going to be Professor Wu Xinbo from Fudan University, one of China's preeminent professors of international relations. And my good friend Wang Zichen was planning to join us in the audience. Um, and I will give him a proper introduction in a moment. I'm thrilled that he is taking the place of Professor Wu. But without going into the details, one of the reasons the reason we had to make the switch is because Professor Wu was unable to travel to the United States. And without knowing exactly the details, it is the kind of thing that could signal some more difficulties in people-to-people exchange. And so that's going to be a theme that we're going to come back to. But as soon as I found out, less than 2 weeks ago, that Professor Wu was unable to join us, I immediately called Wang Zichen and I said, hey, you said you're coming to this anyway. This seems like a topic, and even 2 weeks ago, this framing seemed quite plausible. This is a topic that you would be great on, and I'm very happy that he's able to do so. Wang Zichen currently serves as a senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, a think tank. He also publishes the very widely read Pekingnology Substack newsletter. I think it's fair to say that Zichen pioneered this model of a newsletter produced by Chinese actors in English with reporting and analysis for Western audiences. And there's been a bunch of newsletters that have tried to emulate his model, but his is still the preeminent one, which is generally read by lots of China observers throughout the world, including in Washington, D.C. Before that, he served for a number of years as a reporter for Xinhua News Agency, the official state media agency. And if you'll forgive me, when Zichen joined my class at the University of Pennsylvania a few months ago, he was talking about how some of the affiliations that he now has, whether they be the Center for China and Globalization or his Substack newsletter, sometimes people question, are these, what we sometimes call United Front agencies? And Zichen said, that's an insult. I was an official state media reporter. I'm not some kind of, So I thought that was a great response and displays his sophistication about narrative and our own environment here. The last thing I'll say is that although Zichen is for the Center for China Globalization, and I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as FPRI, we share a very deep and abiding common loyalty to a very special institution that demands allegiance through songs and financial commitments and funny outfits. I refer, of course, to Princeton University, where I graduated undergraduate, and Zichen is currently doing his master's degree at the School of International and Public Affairs. So, Zichen, my Princeton colleague, go Tigers! Welcome to Philadelphia and to FPR.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's totally my pleasure to be at FPI and in this conversation with Nathan. As he just said, it's not like Daniel 1 month ahead for me, and so it's also a privilege for me to step in at the 11th hour, and I'm sure like Professor Wu Xingbo would have made a much better speaker on this subject. And but these are like an hour away by train from Santa and NJ Transit, so I'm happy to be here. So also goodbye.
So we thought we'd start off by just being very clear about this current moment. And we're both, trying, as all of you are, to figure out exactly what's going on. There's been news in this area consistently for the last 24 hours. Zichan, why don't you say a little bit from your standpoint, as we are reading here in the U.S. that, President Trump has indicated that he wants to levy these tariffs on the entire world, but including on China, maybe especially on China. And the Chinese response has been more aggressive than I think people here necessarily anticipated. The Chinese response has essentially been, well, we are going to match these new tariffs, and they won't be differentiated by area in the way that sometimes they have been. So they really do look, in some ways, reciprocal. How does this moment look to you? And then we can roll back and think about when we framed this initially and thought there was some chance of a trade deal, what that could have looked like. But just this moment, to the best we know, we're not online. We don't know what's happening as we're speaking. But as far as you know, until 6 p.m. today, what does this trade, I don't know if we want to call it like incipient trade war between the U.S. and China looking like?
Well, I think I guess President Trump was like a little bit surprised based on his Twitter or Truth Social post. He said like China panicked, and I'm judging from the remarks by his senior officials in the Trump administration that people were caught a little bit flat-footed. But I think for many senior scholars of China, including many leading experts here in the United States, Beijing's response was not a surprise. Like I think someone was tweeting just today that you do not expect the Communist Party of China to basically to drop their knee and kowtow to the 34% additional tariffs put on China. And Beijing has, I think, signaled its will to mount a very robust defense like in the previous two rounds. So this is like additional 34%, but on top of the 20% tariffs since January 20th. And so that 20%, I think, came in two steps. There was this first 10 percentage point and then another one. And Beijing's response in those two rounds was like, I think it was universally characterized as measured, including if you read the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg, I think it was universally recognized. But Beijing has always been making this very clear, like, to put it very bluntly, if you mess with us, we will mess with you. Like there is no room for to send senior officials to come to the Washington D.C. and beg for a deal. That's not the Chinese playbook. I think it has been messaged quite clearly, and I'm not sure that has been received by the decision makers here in the D.C. But I do believe, like many senior China analysts and former government officials here focusing on China, they perfectly understood that, and also I think if you understand the Chinese political culture, the way China conducts its diplomacy, this is let's just say the Chinese have the Chinese term to describe the Chinese mentality is it doesn't respond very well to bullying. If you want to talk with us, like the U.S. has its own grievances, and if you come here politely, let's sit down and have a cup of tea based on the spirit of mutual respect, then we will have a conversation. But if you, want to simply talk to the Chinese from the so-called position of strength and wield a very heavy stick, but without any, perceivable carrots on the other hand, that's the Chinese response you are going to get. And so that's why we are seeing the basically tit for tat from Beijing very rapidly, I think, at the end of the last week. And it's just full 34%. tariff tit for tat, and then there were other measures, including further controls of like certain exports of minerals. And I think Beijing has shown its resolve, and I think this is something perhaps President Donald Trump doesn't totally understand. And I mean, I understand the mentality and the perception here. It's like the United States has been the dominant power since the World War II. It has military bases across the world. It has, numerous carrier strike groups, and it is the wealthiest country on earth. It has the biggest military. It is the economic powerhouse. So, like, the traditional playbook is always like when Washington says something, the other countries are like respondents, and they are in the weaker position. And so that's the reality people have been operating in. And if you that has been happening across, I think, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, and people take it for granted. And when you are in this environment, when you are in this international reality long enough, that's the sort of assumption you operate on. And but I think if you study China long enough and observe the Chinese reactions to, including in the first term of President Trump's presidency, this is actually not unexpected.
So you said reciprocal and tit for tat, but I think we have to acknowledge that when there's such a great deficit in terms of bilateral trade, U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports is actually a much bigger deal than Chinese tariffs on U.S. imports. There's not that much stuff that we import or export, rather, to China that they can hit. Like, sure, they can hit soybean farmers, and that's an important constituency in the U.S. political context. But these are not really equivalent, right? There's not the same pain on U.S. manufacturers for Chinese tariffs as there is for Chinese manufacturers. So let's say a word about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think especially in the eyes of President Trump, like the deficit, the trade, and since he is the president and he talks very loudly and very often, the perception is it's always about the trade of goods. But if you measure by the trade of goods, then yes, definitely, like China is running surplus and the U.S. is running huge deficits, not just with China, but also with like many countries across the world. But the U.S. also exports other things, intellectual property, services. So I think the my first part of the answer is you have to measure these deficits, the trade, in a more comprehensive way. It's not just about proof. And I think secondly, Nathan made a very accurate point, is that the Chinese exports to the United States is much smaller in terms of volume compared to the U.S. exports to China.
Reverse.
Reverse. Sorry. And but I think there is also this perception here, is that China is still very much export oriented. I think that's actually I wouldn't say like export, and in particular export to the United States, isn't significant for the Chinese economy, but it's not as big as people, I think, here typically presume. Especially, I think, after the first trade war during Trump's first presidency, China has been making a concerted effort to diversify its export destination. And so, like, the relative reliance on the Chinese part of direct exports to the United States is, I think, it's much lower than people assume. I'm sure, like, the tariffs will cause pains. It has already caused a huge damage to the Chinese stock market, which were in a free fall like yesterday. And but I think the Chinese also have I think, at least in the eyes of the Chinese decision makers, the tolerance of the cause of the pain is perhaps larger than what President Trump and perhaps here in the United States would imagine. And he will talk about trade imbalances for a long time. And I think a big part of that comes from basically economics. It's different. Basically, different countries have different competitive advantages. President Trump and his senior advisors, and I think it was a cabinet level official who made the remarks on TV very recently that you will see like American workers working on the screws of of iPhones here in the United States. I'm not exactly sure that's the sort of job that American people really want. I think like the pay is probably under the federal minimum wage, which is already not very high here. And and also a lot of those jobs are also have been like transferred from China to like Vietnam and Southeast Asian countries. Yes, there are like I think there are legitimate U.S. grievances against some of the Chinese trade practices, but these are two of the most important economies in the world, and not just in the scale of the economy, but also by geopolitical and maybe military and political influence. So when there are certain disagreements, the preferred way by Beijing is to through equal consultation, not to shock and awe, and basically try to talk to the Chinese from a position of strength. If people remember, like I think we had some sort of this episode back in Alaska like a few years ago, and it made really good TV at the time. And so I think Beijing at the same time has also said repeatedly it has not shut down the door of negotiations. If you check the People's Daily, which is the flagship newspaper of China, yesterday on the front page, there are two commentaries and side by side. And the one on top is that, China is committed to keeping the door of high level opening up. And the second piece of commentary under the first piece is that, the key is to manage its own affairs well. And I think for quite a few years, Beijing has been trying to really, and I think this is also something that not just the United States, but the European Union welcome, is that try to rebalance its economy to focus more on domestic demand. Basically, China makes a bunch of things, and the Europe and America, which are the biggest consumer markets in the world, they absorb a lot of these manufactured goods. But China is also China understands that a sustained huge trade surplus is simply not sustainable. So it wants to incentivize its domestic households and the corporates to purchase more of its goods. That's a process, and it takes time. And China needs to come up with very in-depth, sophisticated, and also very very painful domestic adjustments. And but this while we are in that process, the very unexpected, well, not totally unexpected, because President Trump has been talking about tariffs for 30 years, and but this sudden unprovoked, and it's not just directed towards China, it's towards including the island which has all the penguins, and that's indeed not very constructive.
Lots of interesting things there. So I want to pick up a couple of things. One, when you mentioned the Alaska meeting, that was early in the Biden administration when Jake Sullivan and Blinken met with Wang Yi and Yang Jieshi. Yeah, and there was a very, very contentious meeting. What happened after that is that Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi in particular ended up establishing a channel of communication that did kind of stabilize things. And I read that Wang Yi has been looking to try to reestablish something like that with the current administration, has been able to so far. You did say something about how China is, in your words, aware of its overcapacity problem and flooding, other markets with these goods. To the extent that China may not be able to export to the U.S. because of these new tariffs, it certainly seems plausible that they're going to end up redirecting a lot of that to Europe, which, you say they want to bring it down, but it does seem in the short term, it'll only go more, and that will further inflame some of those relations in Europe. And then you say, well, but this is a process and slowing down. I think part of the frustration in the U.S. context is how long is the process, right? Because I think throughout the experience of kind of integrating China into the world economy, there's these arguments like this, like, give us time, we're kind of doing this, but like, this is what we do for now. But I think at a certain point, people say like, well, if you haven't done it by now, like, it's a very useful delay tactic to say, oh, we're working on it. Like, trust us, eventually we're not going to be, sending our, overcapacity abroad. But you certainly can understand that politically in these other countries at a certain point, there's like, well, listen, you haven't done it yet. Now we're going to respond in this more forceful way.
Well, first of all, I think, for example, like Nathan and people who have been studying China, like in recent years, there is this key term of dual circulation in China, which basically means like there is this international circulation, pointing to basically international trade, and also the term domestic circulation, which is characterized by Beijing, not just for a foreign audience, but also like repeatedly to the domestic audience. It's like the domestic circulation is like the mainstay of China's dual circulation economy. And so there has been a concentrated and a years-long, I think, strategy and put into place. And I think there was at least a brief moment, I think, nearing the end of COVID, when there was some press reports saying, wow, the Chinese like dual circulation theory with the domestic circulation as its mainstay, does it suggest like Beijing wants to close down its borders, wants to retreat from the international economy? And so I think people do take it very seriously, and it's not just like talking points. It's something the Chinese, not just like the leadership, but also like the Chinese companies are working on it. And what we are seeing is like, for example, in the past 2 years, because China admittedly faces very significant domestic economic challenges. So the Chinese government has been giving like trading, basically subsidies for consumer goods. If you buy let's say a MacBook, if you buy an iPhone in China now, the Chinese government basically subsidizes you for like 1,000 yuan or 1,015, 500 yuan. So, and there are efforts to bolster the social safety net, medical insurance and pension system. So, like concrete examples, concrete actions have been put into place. And from like Beijing's declaration, I think yesterday, it has what it calls like the reserve of a series of policies, and all of them are going into this direction. And on the other side of the coin, I think like people talk about like the loss of manufacturing jobs, the loss of like industrial base here, which is I totally understand. It's a national security. If you see it from a national security perspective, is when it comes to times of urgency, like no country wants to rely on like a distant power, much less let's say not an ally, on very critical like goods and for example medical equipment. That's totally understandable. But like there are a lot of like Chinese exports. For example, if you don't just look at it from the national security imperative, you look at it from the, let's say, a climate change perspective, like the more solar panels, the more EVs, they also serve a very good, greater good from other aspects. So it's not just like these Chinese goods are just cheap stuff flooding the U.S. markets and European markets, and it only does harm to the U.S. or to Europe, and at the same time it keeps like the inflation down, and that's what consumers like about it. I think one perception that the Chinese I think elites and policy professionals perceive is that the U.S. seems to be blaming its problems totally on outside powers. I mean, to a certain extent, that's every country do. That's like even all the individuals do. It's not my problem. It's always everyone else's problem. But so I think the Chinese like diagnosis is that for example, the domestic distribution system here, like the failure to take care of U.S. workers, the failure to basically, as the wealthiest country on earth, not to give like European style social safety nets to its to the poor people. These are the problems that the United States should solve internally by its own political process. And but I think including other countries are not seeing this process happening here in the U.S. And when there are populist movements and including leaders who thrive on such sentiments coming to office, they try to shift all the blame to basically the rest of the world and including to like the biggest manufacturing power out there. I think the Chinese find it very unfair, and I think many other places in the world also find it unfair. I think again, currently we are seeing a trade war, and which is very unfortunate. But I think the worst case scenario is for it to escalate to something else, so let's just. It's also very important to the two countries as the two biggest powers in the world not to allow such things to spill into other areas, because the bilateral relations is just too important. We need to have like strategic stability. Yes, economic pains are very troubling, are very painful, and are very costly. But I think this is also a point I want to make, is that we need to be very vigilant to basically to contain this struggle within this area and not to have it escalate into military conflict.
So we'll definitely come back to the spillovers. That's a good point. And I am going to reserve time for everyone to ask questions. So keep it me short. A little shorter so that we can leave some time for the audience as well. So two main points I just want to highlight. But one, when you talk about Chinese dominance in clean energy technologies, solar panels, and then I believe like 60% of electric vehicles around the world are now being manufactured in China. Yes, you can frame that in terms of like this is a global public good, but if it essentially decimates the ability of other countries to have that kind of manufacturing at all, if it's not plausible for the U.S. or Europe to have the EV industry at a certain point, you can understand how that would trigger the desire for protecting that space. So yes, there's like global public goods, but to say that we'll just take over this whole industry, you're going to have a reaction to that. And that whole narrative, I think, reflects a strength of the Chinese economy right now. But what I think is also true, and is sometimes hard to reconcile with that, and it's used, you've admitted in some of your remarks, like the Chinese economy has its own problems right now. So it is both strong in certain ways that provoke a backlash, but internally there's also a lot of issues, and we've known that for the last couple of years since COVID, that China's had a hard time restarting. To the extent that these tariffs that the U.S. has imposed accentuate that, that's a problem for China, right? Like, so you say the Chinese leadership says, "Oh, our people they'll be willing to eat bitterness for as long as we need them to." But is that really the case? Like, isn't there some point that these kinds of actions harm the Chinese economy even further at a moment when, in broad terms, it is still relatively weak, even though there are strengths in things like clean technologies and electric vehicles?
I think that's actually a good opportunity for like bilateral cooperation, and even at this stage, like we are in the middle of a tit for tat trade war, still cannot be ruled out. And I think this is although like the grand bargain has never been clearly defined, and I think this remains a possibility because it seems that President Donald Trump is not.
But before you get to the grand bargain, just the idea that the Chinese economy is actually not that strong right now, and so these kinds of tariffs could cause real pain. Like, isn't that true? Like,
yeah, definitely. That's why like the Chinese are basically fighting back, and also trying to restart its own domestic stimulus strategy. And what I was trying to say a moment ago is that, for example, you said like all the clean energy products. I think the Chinese are not. They are totally open to the idea to manufacture them here in the United States. And President Trump has said repeatedly that, and perhaps that makes him a little bit different from other, let's say, policymakers is he wants Chinese direct investment. And so, like, I think the Chinese government has never shown any objection to, for example, BYD to open its plants here in the United States to help the Michigan, to help other states to have its own like car manufacturing jobs back. And I think like the battery maker here in China is working on some sort of deal with Ford, and those are the areas I think the two countries can actually try to find a way to work with one another. And in China's development and open up, and the Chinese use a series of measures, which basically in the Chinese term is to use the Chinese market in exchange for technology and know-how. And I think there are discussions here in the U.S. and maybe more so in the European Union to try to adopt the Chinese playbook to somehow leverage the huge market here to basically force the Chinese to share its own know-how, to share its own technology here, and help rebuild the some of the industrial base here in the United States. I think these are all the possibilities, and I just hope like the escalate, and that should be like part of the grand bargain. However one defines it, and however distant it seems right now, and. Yeah, there are also like opportunities over there, and I truly hope like the two sides is 34% and upon those 20%, these are just postures. Like they are still try to scare the other side is just one part of the negotiating tactics. And I'm not sure like there is a way out of this, because tariffs seems to be the sort of thing when you put up, it's very difficult to pull down later. But I mean, if there is still some hope, and I hope they can find a way to after all the shock and awe, and to come together and
so when you think of President Trump from his first term, there was what we all paid attention to of the period where he was talking about Kim Jong-un as little rocket man, threatening almost nuclear war, and then shifted to talking about these wonderful letters that Kim Jong-un was writing him. So, there is some possibility of variation. Early in the Trump administration, a very knowledgeable person in DC told me that President Trump's own instincts vis-a-vis China are not as hawkish as many of the people around him. And to the extent that people around him, so he views China the same way he might view Mexico or Canada. Like he thinks there's a trade deficit. He wants to gain advantage, but he doesn't necessarily view China as an existential threat in the way that many of the people around him does. And so this person in DC told me that to the extent that people around him want to get him to the more hawkish place, their thought was, okay, we start off with, the tariffs that he wants to do, and they're counting on the Chinese reaction to be so strong that it makes him upset and that he gets more. So they kind of like want him to kind of walk along this path. So I think this point that you raised, that there could be this escalatory spiral that is very hard to get out of is quite true. But just before we open it up to everyone, I do want to at least say a little bit about what could have been the outlines of the conversation we could have had a month ago before this round of tariffs and reciprocal tariffs, to the extent that there seemed to be some movement towards a possible trade deal. What was reported by Ling Wei in the Wall Street Journal about 6 weeks ago was that the Chinese saw an opening to approach the Trump administration with an economic deal. And the parts of that deal that she reported and that I've heard seem to be confirmed from other sources is one, a commitment to purchase more, maybe going back to the phase one trade agreement from 2019. There's this perception the Chinese did not ultimately purchase what they were supposed to purchase, and so they would commit to purchasing more soybeans and the like. Second, a commitment to help with the fentanyl crisis. Third, a commitment not to devalue the yuan, not to do currency manipulation. Four, to treat TikTok as a commercial matter. And in fact, there was this reporting that there could have been a TikTok deal yesterday, except it got caught up in all the trade stuff. And lastly, as you said, this commitment to maybe like try to invest more in the U.S. Um, let's talk about that for a second, and I'll put a sort of a fastball on it, which is, and I'm going to say this, like almost none of those things are kind of really stretching itself. None of those are things that, if you're saying, okay, we have really deep dispute, and we're going to try to like, I give you something, you give me something. Mostly, those are all things that China wanted to do anyway, maybe with the exception of purchases. But China's helping out with fentanyl, sure, why not? Treating TikTok as a commercial matter, sure, why not? Does China not want to do currency manipulation? Sure, they don't want to do currency. So, like, they weren't really offering anything real in the negotiation. And so I wonder, what do you think of that? That this idea that even in the moment before we got to this moment, the best Chinese offer was not really that, that, you know, generous an offer. It was a very cautious, more or less what they were doing anyway.
I think like even the concept of grand bargain was like, I think it just found its way across Washington D.C. and throughout the United States. It's not something that the Chinese came up with, and it was never, as I said, clearly defined. Nobody really gets into the head of President Donald Trump. It's like, I guess, to use the words from a very good U.S. scholar, he's his own desk officer when it comes to China. And so I think I do agree with you. Like what you just explained is feasible from the Chinese perspective. Like I think many national security.
For the audience, I'll mention, so what would be less feasible is what the first Trump administration was trying to get was the China to make commitments to not subsidize state industry, to even move away from state-owned enterprises. There's no sense that China is offering anything like that. It's not even on the table right now.
Well, first of all, you are citing a report in the Wall Street Journal by well-regarded reporter here, and I'm not privy to the details in Beijing at the moment, what they were or they were not offering on the table. I think like the Chinese were never like publicly disclosing that this is our bargaining chips, and they shouldn't anyway. And but what you described, I think, for example, when it comes to TikTok, like there are a lot of concerns here about TikTok, and but I don't think there are any concrete example of basically Beijing manipulating the algorithm within TikTok to interfere with U.S. affairs. There is this possibility with like ByteDance being like a company founded in Beijing, so that's the possibility. But from Beijing side, in my understanding, the Chinese government never wants to use like TikTok to meddle with U.S. political domestic affairs, and it would have been a commercial matter if Washington had not basically politicized it or securitized that. And all these other issues, I think China would have to import soybeans from either the United States or Brazil or maybe Argentina and South America. So that's something totally negotiable, and maybe more Boeing planes rather than totally, let's say, Airbus planes. I think those things were like, yes, totally understandable. And I don't think they were, as you correctly said, they are not a stretch. And I think, China joined WTO in 2001, and in the over 20 years since, China did put into reforms that bring the Chinese domestic, let's say, labor practices and the regulatory framework to the international standard. And when China and the European Union signed the China-EU investment deal, like there were a lot of provisions in that which were trying to get the Chinese to commit to a different level of, like, when it comes to SOEs, the state-owned enterprises need to be competitively neutral, and that's an idea under the OECD rules. And these are all the things I think China, Europe, and the United States can talk about. And I do agree that if these ideas were like entertained and even put into practice, they benefit the Chinese like economy and the Chinese domestic distribution of income, and it's going to be good for the Chinese as well. But at this stage, if I can get one message out, is that this current ongoing negotiating tactic just doesn't work with the Chinese. It's never going to work. If you put like 500% tariffs on Chinese exports, you're not going to bring the Chinese down to its knees and come to kowtow to Washington D.C. That's just not how the Chinese operate. It's like back into the 1950s and 1960s, when the Chinese economy was like very, very small and the people were very, very poor. The Communist Party of China never like somehow submitted to the United States. It's a practice not just rooted, people here typically say, oh, it's just the current Chinese leaders' mindset. I think that's not entirely fair. It's something that's in the, let's say, the Chinese diplomatic practices DNA, based on its perceived century of humiliation, its understanding of itself, despite being the second largest economy in the world now, still somehow a weaker party against the Western imperialists and big countries, and being besieged. There is still this perception in the Chinese mind affecting its philosophy, how the Chinese people view themselves and view the world. All these things put together determine that this negotiating tactic doesn't work. And if we can't find a way out of this, and this escalation goes worse, it's going to look very ugly.
So I do want to open it up. We knew there was a danger that we would talk too much. So we talk a lot. And so there's a bunch of things that we didn't get to that I would hopefully can come out from the audience. So we were hoping to eventually talk a little bit about, even if there was a trade deal, whether it could resolve many of the other issues that bedevil the U.S.-China relationship. Maybe that's something that we can ask from the Q&A. We were going to talk a little bit about if there's an escalatory cycle, does it start to impact, just the ability of like you and me to sit here in Philadelphia, or you and me to sit in Beijing and have these conversations, robust. I hope everyone agrees it's been a robust, frank, I ask tough questions. I think that's good that we can do that. And so will the escalatory cycle make that harder to do? So those are things I'd like us to talk about, but we haven't. I'm going to just close with one last question. As you were just talking about, China's entry in the WTO and U.S. and Western efforts to get China to kind of buy into the Western liberal order and to reform its economy. Michael Froman, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, just published this very interesting essay in Foreign Affairs that I was looking at earlier today, where he basically argues that for all these decades, U.S. and the West were trying to get China to act like us, and China was just really resistant to fundamentally changing, to fundamentally liberalizing, fundamentally, opening up its market, fundamentally kind of changing its model of state-owned enterprises. And Froman's argument is that we have become so frustrated by that now we are acting like China. So we are, in a way, like, we wanted China to become like, this is his wording. He said, we wanted China to become like us, but that didn't work. So now we're becoming more like China. And so we are now closing our market. And we are, if you say like the IRA was industrial subsidies, right? We are taking that playbook. And I just wonder, from a Chinese perspective, what do you make of that? This idea that because we got so frustrated that China was not playing our game, that we've decided to now play China's game.
Well, by the way, Michael Froman is also from Princeton, and good, yes. And I have a very smart friend whose name is Tian Yufang. He came up with a term called like "be China by becoming China," and I think that's what you have just described. I do disagree with the characterization that the People's Republic of China has been resistant to the effort to, for example, liberalize economically. If you view the enterprise activities, the new job creation, the sort of like practice in China, it's a more diverse and dynamic society than from 1978 when China launched the reform and opening up. I think if you look at the arc of history, China does become like more free markets oriented, and you have more people come here to the United States and go back, and I do believe, especially when it comes to like very pessimistic observations of China, I do think like this sort of institutions and rules and the familiarity of with and also China is a beneficiary of the international order, and there is like no fundamental urge or impulse to break it down and to reveal something else. I fundamentally I disagree with that. Basically China is very resisting. I think you see a much more dynamic, much more diverse society. And I hope some of you come across a YouTuber with 37 million followers on YouTube. I show speed. He just went to China to go to Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, and Chongqing, and you can go there and see it for yourself. I do believe that some of the changes here in the United States, like some of the changes, I do think it's just not good. It's like, for example, the Trump administration is running around canceling visas of international students. I hope I still retain mine. Going on.
We'll vote on it.
And yeah, those are things I don't think anyone appreciates that. But certain part of, let's say, industrial policy, which used to be a very bad word here in the United States, but basically like more concerted efforts to take care of some of its own like industries, to build the sort of resilience in the economy, to take care of the relatively worst of people. There is no, I think, as Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's economy reform, said, like it's not like black and white. There is only the socialist part, and there is totally the capitalist part. It's always something in between. Like if there are some of the practices that the U.S. thinks is good for its economy, for its domestic coherence, I think that would be a good lesson for the United States to learn. But on the other hand, I think some of the recent policy changes here do get people very worried, and not just by the international students, but by many people here in the U.S. as well.
Okay. Now, when you keep your promises, I have a hand here, and I'll just keep an eye. Oh, so we put so one. Maybe we'll take one by one, but try to be short so we can get as many as possible.
Would you care to comment upon Tom Friedman's column in the recent New York Times?
Oh, did you see that?
Yeah.
Where essentially all the discussion is passe, because essentially he says China is now way ahead, very particular marketplaces, and in the science of like Huawei is
and AI. He especially emphasizes AI.
Would you comment on that?
You go first. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. And I think he actually wrote two OPAS over there. Like he went to China to take part in the China Development Forum, and he met a lot of people. Let me put it this way: China has its own like strengths. It also has its own vulnerabilities. The GDP per capita in China is $13,000. It's like, I think it's on par. It's even lower than Bulgaria, which is the poorest judged by GDP per capita in the European Union. So by and large, that is also part of the reason why like Beijing insists China is still a developing country. It has its youth unemployment at this stage is like something like 20% of the young people can't find a job. That's official government statistics, and it has made breakthroughs in certain like technologies, especially when it comes to DeepSeek, which are under export controls from the US. Everyone presumed that it'd be difficult to come up with something similar, maybe not state of art, the best as OpenAI, but something close enough. I think that demonstrates the sort of resilience on the Chinese part with US sanctions, and maybe prompt some of the thought process back in DC. But I think like Mr. Friedman, he won a lot of like Pulitzer prizes. He wants people to read the piece, and in the effort to balance some of the more extreme like portrayals here, where China is just a cheap labor factory floor. I think he correctly highlights some of the recent technology breakthroughs in China, and no country in the world is perfect. China has its own significant problems. The population is shrinking, it's aging rapidly, while it has not arrived at the sort of like wealthy stage as, for example, Japan or South Korea. So, but one thing I do confess to is, let's say the subway and train system in China are significantly better here than the United States. That's something I'll give it to you.
It's true anywhere. Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you. So you comment on the Trump and his administration not understanding the Chinese mind, perhaps. I also would question whether any of us understand what's in his mind. Part of the risk, I think, is that he's playing to a much different audience. He's really doing this to play to his constituency. And I just wonder what your thoughts might be around that and how the Chinese can respond to somebody that maybe doesn't even really care about
what I like to say this to word on this. So I think, all of us have become like students of our president and trying to figure him out. From my standpoint, I think there are many things he's doing that are consistent with your point. But I do think that he genuinely believes that if there's a trade deficit, that we are being screwed. That's just a deep, and it's resistant to, you'll see there's a lot of people in his wider network, including people like Elon Musk or Bill Ackman, who are completely on board everything else that he's doing. In fact, I think cheerleaders, they are kind of very publicly right now. But this is to my mind the thing he most believes. He most believes that if you look at the numbers and you just compare the balance sheet and what we export is less than what we import, then we're being screwed. And this is how you're gonna. And so to me, like, that's just, it's beyond like to his base. I just think this is his fundamental belief, and it's been a fundamental belief since the 80s in Japan. So I just think that's different. It's a different issue than, but when it comes to China, I think that's all he believes. So there's a lot of people around him, including that he's put in positions of authority, who also believe that, China's doing a lot of other things that are really bad. And he doesn't seem to think that. There's just this number. And so I just think it presents an interesting, in some ways, dilemma for the Chinese leadership. He cares a lot about this. And until you satisfy him on this, he's going to keep hitting. But if you did satisfy him on this, he's much more amenable to the grand bargain than anybody else in his orbit. So maybe I'll rephrase it like that for you.
Thank you for the question. I think I have a few points to make. One thing is, just as you said, like if Americans, including like very experienced former government officials, can't figure out what President Trump is thinking, maybe it's even more difficult for Beijing to do that. I think that's quite natural. And secondly, I think if you ask me like 1 month ago, I would say like Washington was sending very, very mixed signals. I'll give you one very concrete example is he signed the America First investment memo, which is out of the White House and put on the White House website. And the next day when they were holding the very first cabinet level meeting, when Mr. Elon Musk wasn't wearing a suit, if you remember, and President Trump told TV camera on screen that, I welcome Chinese investments, like very much there. It's totally like contradictory. It's not the thing he signed yesterday. So I think these things are very difficult for not just the Chinese but also Americans to understand. And thirdly, I think there is out of the respect of the mighty power of the United States and the presidency. One of the things I'm a little bit concerned is I think the Chinese may be reading too much into the policies currently out of the United States to believe there is some sort of grand strategy, there is a coherent steps outside it. I guess if I poll this room by raising hands, many of you wouldn't agree with that. And if you read, for example, Derek Thompson in The Atlantic, I think he wrote a very good op-ed yesterday, which can be summarized as nobody knows anything. And, the author of Abundance, the book people everyone is talking about. So I think there is this potential risk because Beijing takes the things. I don't think you can blame any capital in the world. This is the United States. Come on, this is like the mightiest country on earth, the highest office in the land, the leader of the free world. You have to take him seriously. When he does something, it surely must have come through like some very sophisticated policy making with all these billionaires and experienced officials behind him. But maybe he's just not thinking this through very thoroughly. I think there may be some. I hope that there wouldn't be some sort of strategic misunderstanding from this process.
I'm gonna come. So I have two here. So Jalgu and then Deb, and then there was
One here and then one side these two, and then
here. So we'll do like a circle. If we go like 5 minutes over, is that okay to just kind of get all these questions? Okay. So everyone remember to repeat. Yeah. Especially you.
So to try and I'll get into this more quickly. So to catch up with what you're saying, and to maybe tie into potentially the fear of spillover in this context of tit for tat tariffs and call it America's policy, let's say, vis-a-vis Greenland, Canada, renaming bodies of water. How does that play in the Chinese mind? How are you guys reading that?
And let me add it. Does that make it more likely that Xi Jinping says, let's go invade Taiwan?
I think when it comes to Taiwan, people focus on the part of the Chinese statement which says, the mainland reserves the right to use basically military means to reach unification. But the overwhelming majority and the starting sentence is always China strives for a peaceful means to unite or reunite with Taiwan Strait. I think since the President William Lai Ching-te came to office in Beijing, in Taipei, I'm sorry, the Chinese mainland has conducted, I think, 2 or 3 rounds of military drills. Each was in specific response to a specific incident. For example, the latest one it wrapped up in 2 days. It was in response to his remarks on, I think, March 13th or March 14th. Its targeted. It's meant to send a message. There is no timetable here on the Chinese mainland to achieve a certain outcome. On the other hand, I think the emphasis here on the U.S. should be send its message, use its representative office in Taipei to tell the DPP authorities, to tell the Taiwanese leader not to cross the red line. And the rest, the U.S. alienates its traditional allies. You can't blame China for trying to cultivate a better relationship with the European Union or the rest of the. Let's be honest. If anyone is smart, they're going to do that. But I think there is to be frank, I think there is a ceiling to that. It's not like China and the EU is gonna set up a free trade zone tomorrow, or become allies in terms of security or military. I don't think that happening.
I should say your view on this is informed when you were a journalist for Xinhua. You were based in Brussels.
Yeah, so I was based in Brussels for 2.5 years.
So why don't we just take these few things and then you can just respond to everything to close it out. So just each person says something. So Jalgu, Dev, and then here, and then you just respond to all of it. Jalgu, go ahead.
Hi, thank you again for coming. I'm Javier from Harvard College, and I think from the U.S. perspective, we see China in Africa as neo-colonizing Africa, trapping African countries in debt that they can't afford. And I think when we think of China in the Middle East, we think them gaining leverage through security issues in the Middle East, such as the war in Gaza or the Red Sea crisis. And I was kind of wondering, what is the Chinese perspective on policy towards Africa and the Middle East with regards to security, the economy, and kind of U.S.-China relations, and also especially.
No, also that's already
okay, sure.
So that's very good.
I challenge your suggestion that what China
Pulls the green light on.
I know it just stopped.
Just press. You don't hold it in.
Oh, okay. I challenge your suggestion that why China is doing what it's doing is anything deep-seated. With China in 2018, they paused, waited, tried to negotiate, it failed, and then they slammed the U.S. This time they slammed immediately because I would suggest they learned something from the 2018 experience and from the trouble Mexico and Canada have been having. What I'm wondering now, we've seen the EU respond today. Clearly, China alone, I mean, their 2018 tariffs were strategic, but given the trade deficit, not enough to change behavior. It's going to require global coordination and a pretty hard slam, because it's not going to be Trump figuring out his mind, who knows. It's going to be when Congress panics. And so my question is, do you think the Chinese are reaching out, trying to coordinate with Europe, trying to make things actually impactful enough?
One second away.
I'm curious, since you raised the point, at least the question, if some of these leaders in the United States, company executives, billionaires, other people of wit and accomplishment, get Trump's ear and can convince him of some problem. Is there a counterpart in China? Given that these are state-owned enterprises, can the heads of those enterprises actually independently approach the leader, or are they dependent on him for that position and they have to sort of suck up and tell him what he wants to hear? Do we have a similar arrangement?
Thank you for all the questions. I just want to say, Dad went to China and studied China even long before I was born. So he is really an authority on China matters. You feel free to ask more questions. And I do think the political mechanism in China is very different from that here in the United States. For example, the highest level leaders of Chinese state-owned enterprises, they are on the level of, let's say, provincial or ministerial levels in the Chinese hierarchy. So they are like 2 notches down from the top leader in China. So it doesn't work like Bill Ackman or Elon Musk can go to Mar-a-Lago and, sort of like talk with President Trump in their way. I think it says...
And just say, hey, boss, you're screwing us. You're killing us. Don't do that.
I think it's different. And that actually has implications. I think the Chinese, you could use the word more rigid when it comes to conduct like diplomacy here in China. But here you have a less restrained president here who it seems like to use maybe, let's just say, untraditional means of diplomacy to talk to people. And here you have a Chinese system which is very much by the book. And so if maybe the Chinese are used to talk to State Department, to White House, National Security Council, then there are former ambassadors, senators, and the billionaires coming to send a message. I think there is some sort of difficulty in managing the communication between, which is why I think there are news reports out there saying the communications between the two sides are not going very well. I think there is some sort of lost communications over here. And on the question,
before you do that, I'm just going to add one sentence to this: is that there is a very interesting parallel on the Chinese leader Xi Jinping's ultimate decision to bring down the COVID controls, because in the same way that I said, Trump felt very strongly or feels very strongly about the trade deficit number, Xi Jinping was personally invested in, from all the reporting that we've been able to see, that he was personally invested in these COVID controls. And there was this whole period of time where everybody was telling him, this is causing economic pain, this is causing economic pain. And he just wouldn't budge until it just got to the point where there was actually protests on the street. And then he was like, okay. So there is, the two of them have in some ways, I think the parallel of your question is, when does all these people telling Trump, when does he finally go, okay, fine. Anyway, keep finished here.
Yeah, when it comes to the question to, I guess, Africa and Gaza, well, I would say in a very relatively short period of time, I think China has little real interest in geopolitical interests or outside its immediate neighborhood. I think the Chinese plan in Africa and it's still largely economic. Of course, it serves its diplomatic strategy and purposes, but it doesn't have not just the let's say the ambition, but also I question if the Chinese has the capacity, the capability to project the power, to carve it out to kick the U.S. out of a certain region. I fundamentally question that, and I was wondering if you were like referring to the debt trap. If you do, I suggest, like, for example, you go read studies by Yufeng Huang Yufan at Cornell University, who is a PhD candidate there. They do a lot of like very good job on studying the so-called debt trap narrative. I think it's a rhetoric that was never proved. I mean, come on, does people really lend out money just to have the loan default? I think that's not common sense. It doesn't work. And today there is no Chinese taking back of any solvent asset, any port, any highway, any airport from Central Europe or Southeast Asia or Africa. There is no record of that. The Chinese aren't gonna put PLA troops to Sri Lanka and say, now you owe us $10 billion and the port is ours. Actually, if you can Google this, like the Chinese ambassador to, I think, Sri Lanka was saying like China lost quite heavily in its like investment in Sri Lanka. And Deb, I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
Are they going to team up with Europe and others to really slam the U.S. hard enough to get us to like deal with the tariffs?
Well, I hope they try as hard as they can, but as I said, I think there is a ceiling to that potential like friendship, because there are like deep structural problems between China and the European Union. And for example, there is this China-Europe, of course, the investment accord is held up because the Europeans sanctioned the Chinese, and the Chinese sanctioned the Europeans back, including every major political party within the European Parliament, which is required to ratify the deal. And with the sanctions still in place, it's very difficult to imagine that. But I think there are signals already coming out of Brussels and various other countries that because President Trump seems to I don't know. He seems to remove every single underpinning of the alliance between the United States and even Canada, which I just can't think of why. And this transatlantic relationship, like they don't seem to have like the same ideology, the same like values, which he doesn't value very much, and also he questions the security commitment to Europe. So. Well, I think Rear Haas and Andrew Blanchett said in a very recent Foreign Affairs interview that there is nothing left in this sort of like foundations between the alliance. I wouldn't go that far. I think there was, 70 or 80 years after the Second World War, still has a lot of like legacy over there. But I do think like that sort of foundation has been shaken tremendously from Washington.
Great. Thank you all for these great questions. Thank you, Zichen. This was terrific. Great.